This week's reading is from Rays to the One Light, weekly commentaries on the Bible and the Bhagavad Gita by Swami Kriyananda. Self-effort, too, is needed. Truth is one and eternal. Realize oneness with it in your deathless self within. The following commentary is based on the teachings of Paramhansa Yogananda. These past weeks we discussed the need for balancing self-effort with receptivity to divine grace. Both are important in the spiritual life. Passive dependence on grace hasn't the magnetism to attract grace. Boastful self-confidence, however, which closes itself off from the higher divine power, is shallow, brittle, and, given life's many uncertainties, susceptible to ultimate failure. There is a story in the Bible that illustrates the need to put forth personal effort so as to draw magnetically on the divine power. The story occurs in the Gospel of St. Luke, chapter 8. But as he went, the crowds nearly suffocated him. Among them was a woman who had a hemorrhage for 12 years and who had derived no benefit from anyone's treatment. She came up behind Jesus and touched the edge of his cloak. As a result, her hemorrhage stopped immediately. "Who was it who touched me?" Jesus asked. When everybody denied it, Peter remonstrated, "Master, the crowds are all around, pressing you on every side." But Jesus said, "Somebody touched me. I felt power going out from me." When the woman realized that she had not escaped notice, she came forward trembling and fell at his feet, and admitted before everyone why she had touched him, adding that she had been instantaneously cured. "Daughter," Jesus said, "it is by your faith that you have been healed. Go in peace." Self-confidence and self-effort are necessary, as the ignition of a car is necessary to the motor. Of what use the ignition, however, if the motor itself will not work? Wise is he who recognizes the real power in the universe and guides his life by that supreme power. As it says in the Bhagavad Gita in the 9th chapter, "To those who meditate on me as their very own, ever united to me by incessant worship, I make good their deficiencies and render permanent their gains." Thus, through Holy Scripture, God has spoken to mankind. Om, Om, Om.
Good morning, everyone, and all of those out there in La La Land. Welcome to Sunday service. In that great race of the Irish, that great race of poets and saints and brigands and drunks, they say that it was they who gave the Scotsmen, or whatever they're called themselves, the bagpipes. But the Scots never got the joke. Okay. What are you, Scotch? When in Nova Scotia, there was a man who played the bagpipes, did little gigs here and there on the island. And one day he got a call and was asked to play at the funeral, the graveside rather, of a poor man who had no friends, no relatives, nobody. But that the Pauper's Field, as it used to be called, was out in sort of the backwoods of Nova Scotia. So anyway, he went there, and this was long before GPS, and basically, as he said of himself, "I'm a guy, I don't ask for directions." He got lost and was late. So he shows up, and there's the green grass and a big hole, and there were some workmen sitting there on their shovels having lunch. So he felt sort of bad. Obviously the funeral people, a priest or something, had gone. So he comes up, he looks down into the hole, and he sees the concrete lid on the thing. He says, "Well, I'm here. I come all this way. I've been paid to play. So he started playing bagpipes, and he played Amazing Grace, and then the workmen got up and they gathered around, and it was really beautiful, and pretty soon they're all sort of weeping a little bit like this, and so he's finished and head down, but his heart was full, as he said. He turns to go back to his car and overhears one of the workmen say, "Boy, I've been doing this for 20 years, but I've never had anything like this when I dug a septic tank." This story from the Bible fits right in, as you can see. And but I've always enjoyed, when I read the Bible, I don't know why, maybe others do this, but I try to envision the scene, try to live it. And there's a scene where Jesus is walking, I don't know, the Bible doesn't really say where, whether in a town or elsewhere. And he's just crowded. Well, this is probably at the height of his popularity, if you will. And he's just crowded all around with people. And they're all sort of begging. They all want something from him. Reaching out, trying to touch him. Gimme, I want this. Or, bless my baby, bless my whatever. And, like this. And so all these people are pressed around. He's trying to walk somewhere, I suppose. And his disciples are probably trying to fend off these people and so forth. Maybe they had an appointment. They were in a hurry to go somewhere, is what I imagine. And then this incident happens. He stops suddenly and says, "Power hath gone out of me." And Peter was a bit annoyed. I mean, the scene must have been dusty and hot, and, it's just... And Peter was a bit annoyed at Jesus, I think. And so, for heaven's sakes, Pete's sake, that's probably what he said. All these people, I mean, what are you trying to say? But Jesus felt something different. And in that scene, and what we're told, is that this woman reached out not as a beggar, not as somebody impoverished, somebody needy, somebody who looked really outside of herself in truth. She felt the power within herself and did what she felt to do. She took a stand, as it were. She reached out for the source of grace and was healed. And he endorsed that by saying, "Woman, it was your faith that healed you." This reading today is about the need that we have in our lives for self-effort. Ironically, however, we live in a culture where we don't really need to hear that. I mean, not people gathered in a place like this anyway, because nobody's going to meditate for you. You have to do it yourself. For the most part, our culture stands for self-effort, stands for self-initiative, stands for freedom. So in some ways, it's not that message. The last few weeks, the message of the readings was the need for divine attunement. And yet, our teacher, our founder, Swami Kriyananda, who wrote these weekly readings, felt to follow up with the reminder that it is through our self-effort. Faith starts with each one of us. And faith really starts in a long evolutionary cycle of consciousness, and its unfoldment really starts with faith in ourselves. Because those who are beggars, and we've come out of a long era of centuries where the spiritual path, the spiritual aspirant, or the world itself, people were locked in social immobility, locked in poverty and desperation for the most part. I think in the Middle Ages, let's say. And so the relationship to God was that of a pauper to the king, if you will. A fairly unbalanced, unhealthy relationship, I think most of us would say. And so we have that kind of backdrop, particularly when we go and reach out to the divine, that we are nothing. I can think of a joke, but I'm going to let it go. And so we have that attitude, and so to be reminded. And so in our culture, we perhaps overly so, boast about ourselves, and we reach out, we get education, and it's all about me, the me generation. So, okay. And we've talked about in the prior weeks the need to open up to divine grace. But we cannot deny, and the very practice of yoga, including meditation, affirms and requires that intention, that self-effort. In the book by Anne Morrow Lindbergh, she was, if you don't know, the wife of Charles Lindbergh, a great writer in her own right. And if you don't know, as an aside, Yogananda, as we address him as master, wrote that and spoke that Charles Lindbergh was a reincarnation of Abraham Lincoln, achieving thereby in that incarnation as Lindbergh the acclaim that he was denied, if you will, mostly by his assassination, but during his years in the White House, certainly the acclaim that was his due. Strange story for sure. I don't want to dwell into that. But Anne Morrow wrote in her book, Gifts of the Sea, she said, you know, when you go down the beach and you see all these beautiful seashells, you know, the temptation is, and children or adult children, you know, try to collect all the seashells and bring them home, and they're falling and so forth. She says, in truth, when you find one that's beautiful, and okay, maybe they're all beautiful, but when you just need one, she said, and when you hold that one up, and in the context of the space and time of that moment, whereby you behold the perfection of beauty, that is where we start. Center, he said, Yogananda in his autobiography said, the divine vision, the divine presence is center everywhere, circumference nowhere. And in that space and time is the beauty of our soul. And in that space and time is the point and position from which we evolve and from which we act. There's a story of, it's this book, Soul of Money, which I've been being pressured to return, so I had to take time yesterday to reread it, or to finish reading it. A lovely book, a little bit out of date, and all of the principles are things that we do here at Ananda, so it wasn't anything that way, but a lot of wonderful stories. And it's by a woman, Lynn Twist. She was a fundraiser for the Hunger Project. Very inspiring book. At one point, she went to Senegal in West Africa. It's right on the tip, you know how Africa is and so forth. It once used to be a slave trading outpost and port with a history along those lines. But anyway, she went there, and mostly the country, small as it is mostly being subsumed by the Sahel Desert. And so she, with a small group of people, went far out into the desert, and they stopped in the middle of the desert, shut off the engine to their Jeep, and listened, and they heard drumming, and the guide knew what to do. And so they went to this little place in the middle of this desert's like talcum. It's like orange talcum. It's everywhere in your hair, you know. And between two baobab trees, how do they live in this desert? I don't know. Several villages had gathered knowing that she was coming to see how she could help, because they were running out of water in the desert. And so they gathered, but what struck her immediately was they were drumming, and the women were dancing, and the children were playing, and they were all dressed in their colorful robes and so forth. She expected to see these sort of hangdog kind of people, but they were filled with hope and vitality. And they're also of the Muslim faith. And so when they gathered finally after their welcoming dances and things, it was the mullah and the men who are on the inner circle and the women on the outer circle. And so they were talking and, you know, all their problems. And so she said, Lynn Twist said, I'd like to talk to the women. And anyway, so they didn't know what else to do, so they let her talk to the women. And so she did, and she asked them what they thought the solution would be. They said they believe that there is underground water Belize. There are about 16 or 17 villages scattered in this desert. They believe there's water under there. But the men won't listen. And they won't let us dig because, women aren't supposed to dig. I don't know why. Anyway, and so she listened, and then she presented that to the men. Well, to their credit, they listened. Doesn't happen often, I know, but they did. And so they let the women start digging. And sure enough, they found an underground lake. And they solved the issue. They just needed somebody to listen. Somebody to come outside the confines of the ego and its commitment and its habits and so forth and say and listen to what the underground river within ourselves. When I think how many times, I bet each one of you could stop and pause and think of a time you've listened to that still silent voice and that perhaps some very important change that you made in your life. I think to that young man, age 22, 1948, having just read the autobiography of a yogi in New York City, who got on a bus and traveled 4 days to Los Angeles, and after some struggles and disappointments, was finally introduced to Paramahansa Yogananda, a man who could never have imagined but days before that he could utter such words as, "I want to be your disciple." Something clicked, and he got on that bus. I think of hundreds of people I know. I came back from India after over a year of searching and traveling and coming up empty. And when I met Padma, who introduced me to the autobiography, talked to me about Swami Kriyananda and Nanda Village, there was not even a question. I never looked back. And we have our friends here, Parvati and Latika, and hundreds of other people that we know who in the foundational years of Ananda Village, whose work has now grown to be worldwide, 9 communities and untold numbers of thises and that's. And it's not about size, it's about that call. And people who came in those early days when there were no beautiful temples, there was no beautiful anything. Swami Kriyananda would say in a talk, "And this place is so beautiful." And I looked around as red talcum powdered dust and dirt and a bunch of old teepees and trailers and these scuzzy looking hippies and, didn't look that beautiful to me. And yet, of course, I knew what he meant. How many people can answer a call from within without any outer validation, any social sort of acceptance? It's not easy. As the work grows, of course, we have been blessed to do things like this. What about the people who saw the vision of this temple? What about the people who were so lacking in funds that they had to do work exchange for their foundational course in Vraja Yoga, but who began the practice of tithing, and who in the end funded the $1 million gift that began to enable the vision of what we now are privileged to have. And the same call coming now from Ananda Village to build a replicate, a larger replicate of this for everybody worldwide as a symbol of our commitment to stand up and to be the change. What about the time after the fire at Ananda Village when there was no, I like to say there were no homes and fewer jobs. Ended up 40 of us living in nearby Nevada City and we had a little ashram, the church, the garage of the eternal religion we called it, where Padma and I lived and lived with other people and so forth and started businesses. It takes that sort of, when there's nothing else to validate you, but you feel an inner call to be bigger than yourself. This is what we're talking about. This is the sort of call from above. I think of when we were trying to get this thing together to build it, we were told by the contractor, listen, you can't just fundraise every year and, put up a stick here and a window there. You don't build like that. By the time you do it that way, it'll cost 3 times if you spread it out. Why don't you go get a bank loan? Us? A bank loan? Just few, what do we have? Maybe less than 200 members at the time? Padma and I put together these portfolios of all this financial data. We went to 13 banks, 13 local banks, before finally a woman across the table looked at us and she said, I like you guys. Let's do it. And she went upstairs, so to speak, with the higher-ups and fought to give us a construction loan that turned into a mortgage, and which, by the grace of God, we paid off many years earlier with a private member loan who was inspired to help us. This is what it takes to live the life of faith, where it begins with self-effort. I want to read a poem that comes from this book that inspired me. It's one of the favorite Sufi poems attributed to Hazrat Inayat Khan. He writes, I asked for strength, and God gave me difficulties to make me strong. I asked for wisdom, and God gave me problems to solve. I asked for prosperity, and God gave me a brain and brawn to use. I asked for courage, and God gave me dangers to overcome. I asked for love, and God gave me people to help. I asked for favors, and God gave me opportunities. I received nothing I wanted. I received everything I needed. And I would add that on the path of self-realization, we could add a phrase that said, I asked to know God, and He gave me meditation. There's a story from the Amazon basin, from the Achuar people, who had a prophecy they held on to for thousands of years. They said there was a time in the past when the people of the eagle and the people of the condor lived together in peace. But the time had come when they were separated. But they had a prophecy that said the time would come again when the people of the condor would come and rejoin with the people of the eagle. For the people of the eagle are those of intelligence, intellect, of knowledge and power, but they would be impoverished when that time. There would come a time when they'd be impoverished spiritually, and the people of the condor, people of grace and wisdom, would come, and they would join hands together and fly together. Now we think of that image as two equals. We might think of that perhaps as the two sides of the brain. But the truth is something higher and deeper, because the people of the condor represents the symbol of our higher self, our superconscious self, as the term Yogananda gave. He would thunder, the time for knowing God has come. And as I've said in past talks, basically the antidote to the rise of self-awareness, self-respect, which inclines all too naturally and easily to egotism, is the awakening of the divine nature, the offering of the ego self, renouncing the little self into the great self of all. And meditation is something that, as I say, nobody can do for us. And we can teach we do teach meditation. And next weekend will be one of the two sacred weekends whereby we will give Kriya Yoga initiation to those who have undergone 7 to 12 months of preparation and training for it. And this opens up for us that condor, that bird of the winging on the wing of the soul. But anybody can learn to meditate, but you have to want to meditate. Because as Yogananda said, the soul loves to meditate, but he said the ego hates to meditate. And those of us, which means most of us in this room, who do attempt to meditate, know what that voice is. Culturing, as it were, the company of the saints, which is to say one another, who is simply a saint who never gave, a saint is a sinner who never gave up. cultivating the company of the Sangha, the company of those making the effort to attune ourselves to the highest self. To meditate deeply, it's simple. You simply have to want to. You know, I like to say we're out to overcome oughtism. I ought to meditate. Doesn't work. We need wantism. We want to meditate. And to cultivate that cannot come if during the day of activity we're restless, we're angry, we're irritable, we're, just never focused. And he gave us a simple technique. It's simple, but like all simple but true techniques of awakening, takes effort, which is simply resting our mind's eye at the point between the eyebrows as we go about our daily business. We awaken that higher functioning that even scientists finally accept and have studied and have proven, that the highest functioning of our ability to be courageous, to be wise, to be calm, to be activation of the prefrontal from eye to eye. If we do this kind of thing, we chant silently during the day and so forth. In a recent blog, I talked about some of the things that I do. As soon as I get up, even if I don't use the physical motions, if I'm at all hesitant or resistant, I start mentally chanting, I am awake and ready, and go on with the other 5 affirmations that we sometimes do. Or chant the Gayatri, and just because, as I've said before, our thoughts are all but worthless. We can never remember them. It's like most of our dreams. It's just sort of garbage in, garbage out. But if we can focus our mind during our activities here and lifting up our energy, then at the end of the day, meditation is not only natural, it's a great gift. That's what we have to cultivate with our ability to use our own self-effort. I want to tell you one last story. It's about a woman named Gertrude. And this woman, Lynn Twist, who is a fundraiser for the Hunger Project, forget what year this was, it was back a ways. She had a very busy schedule and doing presentations to groups in America on the big Hunger Project. And so she had had an appointment to go to New York City, to Harlem. She herself lives in San Francisco. But at the last minute, she got an invitation to stop at this big, giant corporation in Chicago that was a food corporation. She refused to name the name. They had had a scandal or something publicly. Their PR was down in the dumps. And so, as she put it, they wanted to assuage their guilt by giving a substantial contribution to the Hunger Project. But it had to be on a certain day. It was in the same morning she was supposed to go to New York. She figured out all the complicated plane connections, got all dressed up, and got to this big skyscraper in Chicago. And the elevators couldn't even go to the penthouse where the CEO was without switching elevators. And then she gets there, this huge view of that, whatever that lake is in Chicago and so forth, and all this blinding light. She could barely see the guy behind the desk. So she rolls out her pitch for the Hunger Project, and almost no response from this guy. He opens the drawer, pulls out a pre-printed check for $50,000. He wanted her out of there as soon as he could. To the airport to get to New York City and left. Oh, she's all dressed up. She makes it to New York. It's pouring rain. She goes into Harlem, right? And it's in this old beat-up church down in the basement. 75 people gather to hear her. There's buckets everywhere doing the water and all this stuff leaking through the thing, and she's the only white person in the crowd. And she's thinking, boy, what a contrast to the penthouse I was just in. And so she gives her spiel. At the end of the spiel, dead silence. Finally, in the back row, Gertrude stands up. She's tall, very dignified, and she says, "Lady, I like what you said, and I like you. But you know, for me, money is like water. Some people, it's raging through their life, but for me, it's just a trickle. I consider it my responsibility and privilege to help as many people as I can with the trickle I have. Now, I just earned $50 doing the wash for a white woman here in town, and I'm going to give you that $50. She stands up and she walks slowly to the front, puts, ones, fives, a couple of tens, puts it in the little basket, goes to her seat. Finally, another one, and another one, and another one. Pretty soon, the basket's overflowing. Lynn has to open her briefcase, in order to get all this stuff. At the end of the day, it was $500, which back then was probably double what it is now from these people. But underneath those dollars was that check for $50,000. She went back to San Francisco she felt the sort of the guilt and the lack of heart with which that was given. She mails it back to the COO. Says, why don't you find something you put your heart into? Well, 6 or 7 years later, and he's retired on a fat pension or something, she gets a letter from him with a check, a personal check for $50,000, thanking her for that day. One by one, self-effort comes from within. And the greatest change that's happening on our planet, as in fact, though she worked for the Hunger Project, she herself speaks. We've seen that in the giving of rich nations to poor nations, we generally blow it and just make people more dependent. She understands, which is why I like the book so much, that the change is a change of heart, and the change is the change of lifestyle that individuals make to impact the world around us and to uplift their lives from the sense of lack into the sense of self-sufficiency, contentment, non-attachment, and compassion. This is the self-effort that we're called to do on whatever level our lives, simple and hidden as they may be, or grand and on the stage of the great drama of the outer life, perhaps. Doesn't matter. But like Gertrude, we can make a change. We can make a difference.